Good morning and welcome to Super Branding on DZRJ 810, Voice of the Philippines. And here's your host, Larry Bruhard.
Hello, good morning. My name's Harry Tambuatco. I'd like to welcome you here on DZRJ. Now, this is not Larry, this is Harry. Now, at this point in time, that mic's on, okay? And at this point in time, I'd like to discuss for this morning an issue that's been baffling me for some time. Sa inyo nakikinig, no, itong issue pong gusto kong pag-usapan ay yung mga restoration ng mga simbahan at mga lumang building. Kasi ito nga po, this has all become very relevant recently because of course the earthquake that we have just experienced in Bohol. But other than the old churches that seem to have fallen down, so to speak, there are many issues all around the country where old structures can fault over hundreds of years of standing. And there are many reasons as to why these buildings collapse. Siyempre, age and maybe the architecture or the engineering has sort of fallen over the years. Now, my topic, what I'd like to discuss over this morning is the rationale, bakit natin pagagawa, paano natin pagagawa, or aayusin, who is to pay for it, diba? If it's for the church, di ang simbahan magbayad. If it's for history, national monument, siyempre gobyerno, but ano ang purpose? In a country where we have funds that are seem to be eluding the poorer sectors of society, with the senators pocketing most of it, or if not the executive, shouldn't these structures be more for multi-purpose, for purposes of absorbing times of disaster? You know, kanyari, you have hard rain or flooding or whatever, earthquakes. The multipurpose halls or the national building should be used for this because after all, this is for the people. And should it be for faith or religion, shouldn't the structures be able to accommodate the masses that come in magnitudes rather than the old churches that we have, which are built for 1/10 the size of their current capacity? There are many questions that could be asked. With us, we have an expert here in the studio. We've asked to come on board. His name is Manuel Maximo LC Noche. He's the principal architect and CEO of his company, but more than anything, he also is with the Heritage Conservation Society. Architect Manolo, good morning.
Good morning, Harry.
And thank you very much for being here and being willing to discuss these issues.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. Manolo, let's go straight to it, architect. You are a professional and you have the expertise. What do we mean when you retrofit or when you restore old buildings or churches?
Yeah. Well, there are various definitions that we have to clarify here first. No, one is when you say retrofit. Retrofit means you are sort of fixing the structural integrity of the building or the structure in itself so that it can be useful for the future na hindi siya masira.
You can retrofit an old building without it having collapsed.
Yes, yes. Basically, when you retrofit a structure, you are making it stronger using modern standards.
Okay.
And then when you're saying to renovate basically means you are changing the general activity that's happening
what do you
in
mean by
the structure.
General activity?
Well, assuming that it used to be, say, a living room, you're renovating the living room and it's now going to become, shall we say, an office or...
okay.
So you're renovating it.
You're improving for additional purposes.
Yes, for additional purposes. And this may involve changing the general architecture or the general feel of the space when you renovate it.
That's right.
So this deals
put.
primarily with, change of clients, change of activity, and so forth and so on. Then when you're saying conservation, we would like to preserve...
Conservation as in restoration. Same word?
They're just totally different.
Sige, conservation
when you say conserving, you are basically maintaining a structure the way it is to a certain period in time so that to a certain extent it continues being that way for a very longer period of time. To conserve it.
To maintain, to keep as is, the same look.
Same look. When you restore, you're basically bringing back what was there that has eventually disappeared in time.
So what has been damaged?
What has been damaged is restoration.
Restoration.
Yeah, say, assuming you have an old structure and then something collapsed, and that something collapsed needs to be replaced or brought back, then that's restoration.
For purpose, whatever, for whatever
Yes,
purpose.
Yes. If you go back to the previous definition, conservation, you did not, you did something to the structure so that that particular object would not fall. But then because it fell, then it's restoration.
Restore. So conserve is to maintain bago bumagsak.
Bago bumagsak.
Right.
And then
Okay,
you have
okay.
reconstruction, which is
Iba pa, reconstruction.
reconstruction.
Sige.
Basically, you're rebuilding already what was lost. So
Okay.
you're rebuilding it. Now, why do we want to rebuild it? It's because it is of sentimental value.
Is rebuilding and restoration very closely attached?
It is attached, but there are differences as well. When you talk about rebuilding, you're just basically rebuilding something that may probably look like the old one, but it's not the old one.
Because the engineering is improved.
Different.
Or purpose. Can purpose have changed?
Yes, the purpose can change. The engineering has improved. The materials that you selected has changed.
Okay.
So whereas reconstruction, you are utilizing as much as possible the technology and the materials of the building when the building was initially built.
Engineer, now let's go, since you're with the Heritage Conservation Society, what is the purpose of restoration?
Well, the purpose of restoration is primarily to prolong the identity of a structure in a particular locality.
For purposes of
For
history?
purposes of history, for purposes of basic identity of the people who see that structure in their day-to-day lives.
Can you expound on that? How do you mean by the activity of the people with restoration?
When we take a look at a piece of architecture, a building, regardless of what kind of building this is, this building has a particular and a profound sense of attachment to the people that see this structure on a day-to-day basis. So
Okay.
sabihin na natin, isang lumang simbahan, isang lumang gusali sa plaza. Ito yung nakikita ng mga tao sa araw-araw na buhay nila. No, you may not necessarily be a religious person. You may not necessarily be the person who lives in that house. But then because you pass through that structure day in and day out, for the rest of your lives and for the next generation and the previous generation, then that it's a very
So it's a continuity,
It's a continuity.
a symbol for continuity for the people of the community.
Yes, a symbol of continuity for the people of the community, a symbol of pride for the people of
pride.
the community. Because
pride.
Yes, it's pride. Why do we say pride? It's because simply they have the structure of that kind of quality in that community.
A sense of belonging.
That's a different thing pa.
Iba pa yun.
Yes, when you say sense of belonging, is because when you see a structure and you know that I know that structure and I live near that structure and I'm from that town, that's sense of belonging.
Okay.
Sense of pride, when you say naman, yung structure namin malaki, yung structure namin maganda, yung structure namin luma, that's a sense of pride.
And this characteristic evolves with the people and the community where the structures are located.
Yes.
And this is a real perception of the people ongoing over decades.
Yeah.
If not hundreds of years.
Hundreds of years. It's sort of like sabihin na natin, diba? If you have a house that you lived in as a kid, it's your lolo's house, and then that house disappears, nasunog, nagiba, or it was demolished. The person who has a very strong connection to that property has a very strong emotional value to it. Now, this emotional value may be both positive and negative, no? Positive in the sense that because it's
good memories,
as well as negative, bad memories.
Doon namatay.
Doon namatay, doon ka
bad experience,
or what have you.
Correct,
So, but then these are, remember, as we go along our lives, it is memories are visual. There is an attachment of something that is very visual for us to remember certain things.
So it's not just perception, it's real.
It's real. It's real time.
It exists.
Yes, it exists. For the mere fact that we see it, it becomes now an important tool for us to become a proud person. Proud person that we have seen it, we know it is, we know it is there, it's part of our community, and so forth and so on. And then define that further, it becomes now a national symbol, not necessarily just of faith.
A national symbol is a position of pride.
It's pride for the whole country.
A physical structure, a symbol for pride for the country to identify strength.
Themselves. themselves against the rest of the world. So sabihin natin, sort of like, if you talk about, say, a country like France, the first thing that will enter your mind is Eiffel Tower.
Right.
Actually, during the 9/11 attacks, the French government sent planes to scour over the
Eiffel Tower
because
to protect it. Mahirap na.
Yes. And why was the Twin Towers destroyed? Because it was a symbol of America's or New York's strength. So it's the same thing here in the Philippines.
Yes,
in every small town, in every town in the country, there are symbols, and these symbols are basically the structures that we have there that one way or the other has transcended the test of time.
You being with the conservation, the Heritage Conservation Society, how do you identify, if not source, buildings and structures that should be heritage, that should be for symbolisms? How do you identify these buildings? Because we have seen many old houses in the country, all over the country. And the reason many of them are being demolished, some of them you try to save the windows, the capichels, and they have real commercial value.
Yeah.
No doubt. In fact, even railroad ties, tinatanggal, ginagawang kung anong, di ba? Kasi maganda naman architecturally. But other than visuals, other than aesthetics, which is all very subjective, how about the positions or strengths or sensitivities of commerce, if not the economics of how do you identify them or these things, and for purpose of what?
Yeah. Well, when we talk about heritage structures, now, how do we define them? If we go back to your first question, there is now a law that states that any building 50 years and older.
50 years is the cutoff.
50 years is the cutoff.
Marami na tayong 50 years old and more after architect.
But then again, if you take a look at in a 50-year time span, and how the fetishes of most building owners are, most buildings don't even reach 50 years old. To a certain extent, yes. Marami talaga dyan.
They crumble it down.
They tear it down. It's generational yan eh.
Okay.
An old house that you may have grown up with, but then eventually as your parents pass on, the heirs may be as well not very much interested because their lives may be in a different country already. So the building now becomes susceptible to abandonment and demolition.
Nature takes over.
So this 50 years is just basically a blanket protection.
Interesting, with cars, they're called antique. Pag lumampit ka ng 50 years, antique na yung kotse. Iba na ang valuation.
Yes, iba na. So dito, unfortunately, we don't put very high value to structures
older buildings
of age.
Okay.
So compared to, say, as you mentioned, old cars or anything that is a collector's item,
right.
Wherein the value becomes significantly higher compared to, say, the time it was bought in the first place.
But when I look at antiques, for example, be it for automobiles, there is one other criteria. One is the maintenance, the preservation of the engine, the body, and the look, meaning its use is still utilized. The purpose is still utilized. However, the image, the look, the heritage, the culture is of an era 5 decades ago, but the purpose, its multifunction or its function is still bearable or it's still in use.
Well, it really depends. Now, there are people who collect antiques which don't work, and it's a very nice thing to put as a display object.
As display.
Diba? So,
knickknacks, but for a car, malaki ata masyado. Dapat yan umaandar pa.
Yes,
diba?
Yes.
That's why we see these old cars on car shows, and it's impressive, but unless that's really in good use, magagamit mo, it's totally useless.
Well, it's the same with buildings. If you have an old building and it has its original, say, 1901 Otis elevator that is very interesting.
Oh, gosh, I remember that Otis elevator.
Again, it also serves its value. It has a romance. It has a nostalgia involved to it. Especially if the building is
the Empire State Building, the one in New York.
Especially if it's well maintained. With all of these old buildings in Escolta, wherein you have high ceilings.
Yes, I've seen a couple of
large
those.
Rooms, and you have a very nice address to a certain extent.
But how do you identify? What is your criteria? Because the difference with the building is there is still commerce involved.
Yes,
you have tenants, you can rent it out. There's an income. The problem there is what becomes defeatist is if your building size is not high enough and you're in a high density location where values are very high. You either charge double per square meter to make up for the loss of capacity
Well, there is a big change nowadays, especially when we talk about real estate for, say, commercial purposes. No? That is a big issue pertaining to how or our fight in you know, preserving all of these old buildings and convincing building owners, especially the new
Why?
buyers.
Excuse me. Why do you have to convince building owners? You mean many owners don't understand?
No, a lot of building owners, to a certain extent,
It's all
cannot
commerce.
compete. It's commerce. You know, if you have buildings, say, kunyari in the areas of Manila, Escolta area, the Bayfront, Old Ermita Malate area, where you have a lot of these old buildings dating back from the 1930s all the way to the 1950s. And how can you compete with, say, real estate with, say, Pasig Ortigas or Ayala or even Alabang, wherein you are able to provide, number one, not just the modernity of the space, but secondly, and this is a big factor, availability of parking. And in places like Ermita, Malate, Escolta particularly, there is no such thing as parking. You know, you park on the streets.
Yes.
And the Filipinos, by general, unfortunately, has become so enamored with their motor vehicles that even though it's not moving, they still bring a car. So, and unfortunately as well, as long as government, unfortunately, as long as government is not improving public transport that is decent for a human being to ride on.
But shouldn't building owners evaluate, or these people, these proprietors or these owners, reevaluate the true values of their building because of the historical value, but still make it functional for what it was initially made for? For example, you have a 10-story building, 12-story building with an old Otis elevator with those sliding slats, those those
accordion doors.
The accordion doors, yeah, yung parang mga bakal, no? Like I see that in the movies.
Yeah.
But instead of charging the same rate per square meter in a new modern building, you should charge double because this is a nicer building. But the building has to be fitted properly with certain amenities. For example, sewer, plumbing, the electricals have to be replaced.
Yes.
You can't have 100-year-old electrical wires or you're going to be in a fire trap.
Yeah, but then that is just one aspect of the problem. There are some building owners that are actually undertaking the retrofitting of their buildings so that they can then be accessible to, say, offices like call centers and so on.
Yes.
That may not necessarily require a lot of parking for their employees.
But parking can be the property next door. Somebody else can make money on a parking building. Madali naman ngayon yan eh.
Yes. But the major problem that we need to address here is not just the building's age, but actually it's the building's location. When you talk about location here, we're referring to, again, you have a consolidated business address like Makati, which is run efficiently by an organization.
Yes.
You have a business address like Pasig Ortigas, which is again privately run by a very effective organization.
Yes, agreed.
But unfortunately, you have an old city like Manila, which is run by
the city hall.
And
politicians.
The politicians who unfortunately just wants income but lacks vision. And
but we have to remember these politicians have no ownership because they're only there for a certain period of time.
Yes.
And after their term, kasi hoda, I mean, they're gone.
Yeah.
And unlike proprietary, talagang they're there for the next 100 years.
And that's the problem. Even if you increase your rent or even if you try to promote your address as a very ideal location for business, but your general area is much to be desired. That's the problem of Manila nowadays. It's not just an aspect of that there are a lot of old buildings, but there's a lot of squatters around. There's a lot of vagrants
That's
around.
another problem.
Poor infrastructure, poor transport linkages, and so forth and so on. And to a certain extent, this really turns off a good number of investors in wanting to move to these addresses.
Question: should it be the city's responsibility to look after the conservation of symbolic buildings, to maintain heritage, or should it be the responsibility of the building owner?
Both.
Both, okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have to take a short break and we'll be right back. We'll do a station ID. If you want to join us and you have some nice questions, because I'm going to now, on the second part of the show, I'd like to go to more relevant issues, meaning current events that have overtaken us, because there are a number of buildings that need to be looked at. You can call us. You can go on Facebook. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but drop a line and ask your question. We'll be right back. And with us, we have Manolo Noche, from the Heritage Conservation Society, and we're discussing issues about renovation, restoration, symbolic sites, buildings, churches, especially in view of those 200-300-year-old churches that seem to have collapsed after the earthquake. What to do? Who is to pay? Who should be responsible? Who will gain? Is there commerce involved? Etc., etc. Architect Manolo, before we go on, we were discussing off-air during the break issues, for example, on in other countries, you were saying that government, local government, takes a major role, a participation in the conservation of certain buildings,
Yes.
which they identify as relics, symbols of the city's strength. Here, you were saying that new commercial values are born out of new areas that are rebuilt simply because of the tax take.
I think here, to a certain extent, national as well as local government do not really value the importance of heritage architecture or heritage as a role of nation building, number one, community building, number two, and then tourism and the economic impact that all of these buildings can avail and afford itself.
But they all have all those that you just mentioned. There is value.
Oh, definitely, there's value to it. You know, why do you go to Europe to look at all of these old structures if not for value, diba? And they
Even New York,
and,
yung mga luma.
and if you go to Europe and in some like Japan, China, and so forth and so on, that's what they're selling, and they make millions out of all of
Yes,
these
yes,
old
right.
structures. And all you have to do is make it accessible, clean, and create a story. And tourists are
story.
gullible enough to absorb and take that in.
Plus
And
history.
And history, that's part of the story.
For our people, pride, national
It's
pride.
pride. And once you have pride, and pride is grassroots eh. An ordinary, say, nagtitinda ng chichirya dyan sa kanto, will then have pride in selling their stuff simply because there are people buying it. And why will there be people buying it? It's because you have tourist bus coming in
May
because they're
magnet.
looking at these structures.
There is a lure. There's a magnet.
There is a lure.
that
There
bring
is a
them
lure.
in.
Yeah. So in other countries, government really played a very heavy part in ensuring that all of these symbols of nationhood.
Right.
And when we talk about symbols of nationhood, this involves faith, this involves commerce, this involves everything and anything.
So everything.
It's everything
So
and anything.
It's got to make money. It's got to have a purpose.
Yeah.
But a deeper purpose and meaning would be the history.
Yeah. Actually, the initial purpose of any structure will eventually be overshadowed by the economic purpose of the structure, brought about by its tourism value and the contagion that it will cause the other area simply because economy or business is within that area. Imagine if you have, say, an old church that is heavily visited because of its both historic, artistic, and age factor.
Okay.
And you have busloads of tourists going there day in and day out. The surrounding structures and establishments
Make money.
Make money.
There's commerce.
They sell postcards. They sell coffee. They sell
Tourism. May attraction.
Tourism.
Attraction.
It's tourism. Take a look at what's happening to Egypt now. Egypt has one of the most beautiful
The Sphinx.
historic sites in the world. Transcending time and ages. But nada tourists now because of the political turmoil that's happening
they're
at the moment there. But then once they settle their political aspect, tourists will be going back there again.
Archaeological finds, ibang klase in Egypt.
Even you go to Rome and Greece, you're just looking at rocks. You're just looking at ruins that doesn't have any...
That's so true. Especially Greece.
Yeah.
Yung mga old structures
they're old-
nag-collapse na.
They're old temples that don't have any influence whatsoever with regards to who you are and what we are. But then we go there and we take tons of pictures simply because we want to be beside all of these rocks.
Architect, let's go to the sensitive issue, which is now the current event. I don't wish to be political, especially in the conservation societies, if there's more than one, or the other interested parties, or those that are implicated to be part of the restructure, rebuilding, whatever you call it. We have issues. We have two or three of the 300-old churches that collapsed.
Yes.
Other than the people that are starving or because of the calamity, the disaster. Anong magandang gawin sa mga simbahan na yan? Kung itayo man natin, rebuild it, reconstruct, retrofit. Because a lot of them that did not fall obviously require retrofitting.
Yes.
Who should spend for it? Why should we spend? And should we maintain the same functions that have already been outmoded. Because pagdating sa simbahan, ang daming simbahan, di ka makapasok sa init at liit.
Well, if
What do you
take a
think
look,
about that?
There again is two forces at play here if we're looking at the discussion of how to restore them, no, or to bring them back in the first place.
But
no?
first comes first. We should restore, or yes or no?
Yes, we should.
We should.
Again,
Okay, let's get that out of the way.
We should, simply because, again, as I said,
As we've
this
discussed.
is a national symbol of our, or even a local symbol of the community.
So it's pride. It's
pride.
us.
Yes,
it's
it's us.
our
Yes.
heritage. It's our culture, our character.
Yeah.
Let's not let it slip away and
Yes,
go away. So
and yes.
we tackle the issue. We will rebuild. Okay. Who should rebuild?
Both. Government
Okay.
as well as
And church.
the church.
And community.
And the community, yes. Well,
Pero
when you,
kung
talk
walang
about,
pera-
when you talk about the church, kasi we're talking about the community. I don't think I don't think any priest can simply just pocket out money to build this structure. It's not his in the first place.
Good point.
That's
Good point.
actually one of our biggest debates, especially when you have parish priests who are freely retrofitting and renovating their churches simply because they want to have a legacy behind. They want to leave a legacy behind.
May ganun
And it's
pala.
sort of like, and we're sort of
May
like saying,
politics din pala yan.
may politics, yes, there is capriccio involved.
Personal yan.
Personal yan eh. They want to say na, when I was a parish priest here, I was the one who built this, and so forth and so on.
Gosh, false
So,
pride. Pride
the,
chicken.
Yeah, so the problem here is, again, the question is, but then who owns the church? The church is owned by the parish. The
It's the
parish
people.
is the people.
Yes, good
No
point.
people, no parish, no parish. Bye-bye priest.
Yes.
Diba?
Okay. Design, obviously, to retain the old glory. Agree, disagree.
Agree.
So to try and bring it back to its
Pre-disaster.
pre-disaster
Yeah.
facade.
Yes.
Function. How do we talk about function and new use? Because, for example,
Well, this is where, to a certain extent, there should be an understanding and a collaboration between the parish priests and the community.
Okay.
Wherein, these buildings, remember, should go back to its original purpose. And the original purpose of churches,
Church.
to a certain extent, is community building. It's not
Correct.
just simply a place for faith,
worship.
For worship. That's one aspect, but it's also for community building. If you take a look at all of these churches built during the Spanish period, during the
Yes,
Spanish period, it was the church that actually became the political figure as well.
It
of the
was local
community.
government at
Well,
one
it was local
point.
government at
Yes.
one point. So they need to bring that back to a certain extent. Not that the priest should be the mayor,
Correct,
no,
correct.
but then that the church in itself
Is the community.
is the community, and whatever activities the community needs to use it for, the church is there and open for them.
Architect, where do you draw the line between purpose and function? Because, di ba, pag may bagyo, may disaster, may flooding, or whatever, the people need a place to run
Yeah.
to. Should not the church double up its function? Number
it used
one.
to be. It used to be.
Okay.
If you take a look at these old colonial structures, and they have this very, very large conventos attached
So
to it.
that was the purpose.
That was the purpose. You do not have this very large convento bigger than any multimillionaire's mansion.
Yun talagang purpose
To
nun.
simply house just a parish priest and probably an assistant. It's not.
Yes, yeah.
It served as a multifunctional structure. Actually, if you take a look at the history of these buildings, the first thing that was actually built was the convento. And the convento served simply as, number one,
The
the home
gathering
of the
place.
priest, the gathering place, a refuge place.
A refuge.
Just in case may nasunog, you could stay
Correct,
there in the interim. It could be as well as a gathering, a
I
tribunal.
didn't realize
and
the
so forth and so on.
convento doubled up for that
Yes.
multi-purpose.
Churches were built like fortresses. Because
Yes, they look it.
when there are skirmishes, when Moros are fast approaching,
You can hide behind
this
the
is
thick
where
stone.
the people will go and hide. And thick stones, high windows, so it's a means of protection.
That's
more
why
than
they
anything
look
else.
like fortresses.
Yes. If you take a look lang at history, the siege of Baler, you have for 1 year the Spanish soldiers trapped inside this little small chapel. And they were able to fend themselves away from the advance
Because of the
Filipinos.
thick stone.
Because of the nature of the building
The
as a
nature of the building,
fortress.
as a fortress.
So it serves multifunction. It's a multifunctional structure. It's not just simply a place where you go hold mass. No, that's just one of the activities.
So should we approach the problem? Okay, we need to rebuild it. That's already said. We discussed that. Government together with the private should have a combined effort.
Yeah.
The church should be involved as well.
Yes.
Okay. we've already identified purpose, and for all of that being tourism, culture, heritage, history, etc. Even its function and commerce will be identified because it's already been identified. It already existed.
It exists.
So it will continue to exist. If you build it, they will come.
Yes.
How do we approach restoration towards, I guess this is another question, how do we approach restoration to make it look like what it was before, but to expand its function because these structures have outlived their capacities?
Yeah.
How would you do that,
Number
architect?
one, we will need to either both restore or reconstruct. There are some
Both,
churches there that
yes.
literally pulverize and needs to
Right,
be
right.
reconstructed. Now, when we do restore or reconstruct, number one, we have to address the issues of the basic fundamentals, the structural integrity of the building, the natural nature, the natural aspect of the area. The area is typhoon hit, and similarly, we have this magnitude.
Build it, retrofit it,
Build
to
it
stand
stronger
another
to
100,
withstand
200
another
years.
100, 200 years, right? And then secondly, bring back the glory of what the building looked like by utilizing what could still be utilized amongst the rubble in the structures. Because
So
if we're
make
going
it look
to,
like the old.
Make it look like the old. Because if you're going to make a structure that mimics the old, then it's faking history.
Where do you draw the line there, architect? Ang hirap pala
It's
niyan.
like sabihin na natin what they're doing
Real
now.
stones, the real stones, for example.
Real stones. Like what's happening now in Intramuros. No? In Intramuros, sadly destroyed during the Second World War. They did not rebuild it, but with Presidential Decree 1616, creating the Intramuros administration, they want to bring back the pseudo-Spanish style. And when you say the pseudo-Spanish
didn't it?
style, yes, but then if you take a look at the buildings there, it's fake. And the eye does not lie. You see a building made of concrete, it's not the real thing.
I didn't realize that. Now I'm visualizing it
So
in my mind.
it's all Disneyland.
Yes,
you
it's
go
a fake facade.
Yes, you go to Disneyland and you see a French chateau.
Colombian pictures.
Diba?
Yeah.
If you
Okay.
that's the reason why Disneyland in France never really became very successful. Is because why would you compare a fake chateau with the real chateaux that they have there?
That they have.
So it's the same thing here.
You're
no?
right. No,
So
you're
why
right.
will we rebuild a church that looks like a 17th century structure when in fact it is a new structure?
Mas mahal ang true restoration
Mas
than
mahal.
reconstruction.
Mahal.
Double.
More than double.
More pa.
than double.
Because you have to source the stones.
Not necessarily just source the stones, but you need the expertise. And to a certain extent, we may not have the expertise.
I don't understand.
The stone,
Isn't that just bricklaying? And
no, but we are talking about bricklaying that has been dead for almost a couple of decades. So we're talking about technology here that has already been surpassed by time.
yeah, like those churches in Bohol, because
Yes.
there was one, they had a story about they're using as the glue eggs. Is that correct? I heard that.
There is some truth to that. The way of doing mortar at that time, you don't just go to a hardware and buy a
Glue,
sack of cement.
Yes.
You had to make your cement to a certain extent. You have to make your
Kasi
plaster.
wala no?
And by doing that, you have to get limestone or lime shales.
The hardest stone.
And then you then crush that, wash that, crush that, wash that, and then you then put that in a kiln until it flakes, and then you have that kind of
Jesus.
sedimentary effect that will create, and then you will then get all of these, wash that again, and then mix that with sand, and then mix that with a binder. And your
the binder
binder
is
happens
egg.
to be anything that can bind them together that's sticky, and it usually is egg whites.
When you rebuild and you restore, why go through that process when the modern world has brought about new innovations? Because that's how it becomes fake.
Because it's how it's yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So when you want to restore
truth is what it's about.
It's all about truth. You're not going.
Okay.
They're sort of like
Okay.
saying there are two
Hindi
options.
function, truth.
There are two options, diba? You go to Paris to see the real Paris. You go to
Correct.
Shenzhen to see
the new Paris.
the new Paris. You have an option,
Tama
diba?
nga naman,
This is
ano.
fake. This is the original.
So there's nothing wrong with restoration as long as if you do it properly and bring it back to its old glory.
Yes.
But closest to the reality of the time it was built.
Because when you talk about historic buildings, we're not just talking about, it's a nice old building. The question there is the age. When was it built? Why was it built? What were the factors involved in building it? And what is the history involved in that structure throughout its history and time? So that's what's integral there. Eh. Yung karanasan ng gusaling yan within that area, the history. Now, the building now is totally new, looking like it's an old structure. You lose the history already. Eh. Ako personally, if they're going to rebuild the building there and they're going to make use of modern materials and then just simulate it, I will just probably tell them to just make a new modern structure of steel and concrete. It doesn't even have to look like the old one anymore. Because literally, we ended the history of that building. And we're now beginning a new one. But the question here is this, a lot of people are still living their histories in time, and to a certain extent, that structure plays a very strong and historical and mental chord to a lot of people.
Question: with the devastation of some of our heritage and buildings and the churches, most especially, I can count 3 of the bigger ones and maybe about 6 or 7 of the smaller ones. Should that be undertaken by the local government as far as design or the national government? Simply because here's 100 million, because that was the assessment that we've been reading.
Yeah.
Here's 100 million, tayo mo yan. Or let's give it to the experts, for example, into your society, who understand, so that when you rebuild it, it's built to its old function and glory. So it will continue rather than dissipate the reality and have a facade that's fake.
Yeah, well, number one, I think government should first and foremost build or establish a department that really deals in antiquities.
We don't have one.
We don't have one. We have the National Commission
on Culture
and
we don't have. Yeah, your National Culture.
The National Commission on Culture and Arts is basically just to promote culture and the arts, but not necessarily in the protection of built heritage. So their main concern is identifying, and their main concern is to provide assistance in how these buildings can be promoted, protected. And
your
preserved.
Society, the Heritage Conservation Society, is that all encompassing, meaning national for the whole country,
no,
or just
we are,
certain areas?
We are like we are an NGO basically, and as an NGO, what we do is basically we are the mouthpiece of a structure that cannot talk. So we are the ones protecting.
You protect them.
We protect the buildings.
So you look for these buildings. Wag nyo gibain to. We will stand in front of it if necessary and tell you why.
Yes, we do that. Yeah, we do that.
And we don't have a national government.
Kinakalaban namin dito mga governors, mga bishops, mga...
Even bishops, baliktad, because of commerce. All because of commerce.
No, it's because of, well, yes, number one, you have bishops, of course, who are tied, relatives who are tied to bishops who own hardwares and what have you, and that's where they get money out of it.
Okay.
And then you have as well...
That's terrible. I hate to say it. That's horrible, but sige.
Yes, and then you have, of course, local politicians who, because they think that these buildings are part of their... kanilang pag-aari, then
their
career, because it's the city hall, and they could do whatever they want to do with the city hall. And
politicians should not be given too much a right other than legislation, because the personal interests of politicians are all temporary because of the mandate that they need to carry.
Yes.
And since it's not permanent, they cannot have what you call a real ownership towards any project, especially buildings. What I don't understand is why legislation until to date, until as we speak, we don't even have a professional group that we have put together in maintaining our treasures. Bakit naging ganito? You guys have not done your job. Maybe you didn't go to Congress. You did not lobby.
No,
you have not promoted
what we
it.
lobbied is basically to have this blanket protection against all of these for this old buildings.
Once you've identified it. And you have, to a certain extent, you've identified many.
Then there are various national agencies, like, say, the National Museum. You have the National Historical Commission.
Why don't you all come together in one department? The museum, the national culture, and whatever, diba? You put them all together because you have the same objective, more or less.
Yes.
And expertise.
Well, I hope with this kind of tragedy that occurred in Cebu and in Bohol, that they will, put their acts together. But in reality, to a certain extent, there are sometimes disagreements between these 3 organizations themselves, resulting in some pressing materials not really moving the way they should.
Why? Because of money?
Because of money,
corruption.
Because of politics, because of interests
Interest.
There
Considerations.
There are, of course, you have political appointees within these organizations, and once you are a politically appointed person, you then push for your own
Yes.
agenda. So there are agendas as well that may not necessarily be in line with, say, our agenda.
How would you put a head or a person, a manager, to be on top of all this? Should the person be appointed by the government, the executive, or legislated, or should be career, or
It should be, well, honestly, I have nothing against anyone who is appointed as long as they are in the right field. So if this person
don't put
is,
a doctor to do engineering work.
Yes.
Don't put an architect in front of the battle lines with a gun. I mean,
if you are very close to the administration and you happen to be a restoration architect or who's trained in this kind of profession,
yung expertise mo ando doon na.
Diba? Lagay mo siya dyan.
Tama yun.
We have to put the right
Competence,
people.
in other
it's
words.
Competence. You have to put the right people in the right organization. What I was saying a while ago is that I think, national government doesn't have, like, compared to what they have in Europe, wherein there are really agencies involved in the day-to-day protection, conservation, or rebuilding of these structures. So you have sort of like an agency of antiquity to a certain extent.
What would you call it? An agency of antiquity?
Yeah, probably an agency of antiquity or
Department of Antiquity.
Yes, wherein they really go out and ensure that these structures are stable and that they are...
so independent institution that cannot be politicized over elections and new appointments.
Yeah.
Parang, an independent
because
institution.
we have... It's not just a matter of identifying its historical value, because that's the role of the National Historical Committee. It's not just a matter of sort of like protecting a treasure that can be put in a museum. That's the national museums. It's not just a matter of
But that can be in part of the antiquity.
Yes, it
all
could be.
under it.
Yeah.
And an attached agency can be Department of Tourism.
Yes.
And even for Department of Foreign Affairs, because that's part of the culture.
Yeah, because what the problem here now is that it is only now that we're viewing buildings as treasures. It used to be just simply items, but not necessarily structures. So now that this monumental event occurred, and
it's taught us a lesson.
Second, it taught us a lesson, and that what you have that can actually serve as as a rallying point for any community is gone. Then there is a need now to come together in a table and sit and discuss, what can be done. We need to bring this back. But then it has to be brought back in the proper way, in the right way. Now, if you just have an ordinary...
do you fear that can happen in Bohol?
Oh, yes.
Oh, it's a real,
yes.
there's a real scare in you.
There are already interviews or news that already came out wherein they said that, okay, we cannot rebuild it the way it was done 100, 200 years ago, so we're just going to simulate. That's shocking. Why would you want to simulate something that was destroyed?
Para ke, no? Para masisira din, masisira. Tama nga naman.
Hindi mo bang reconstruct it because it's still there? The big difference here is this. I was approached one time as well from someone from a government agency, and they mentioned to me that should we just declare these as ruins? And I was telling them, no. Why? Because number one, they were never ruins until now.
They were just devastated.
They were just devastated.
Yes.
You declare ruins because for the last 100 years, they've been ruins. And we don't have no identity. We don't even know how this thing looks like. So what we see are just basically this jumble of rocks packed
and
together.
Studies of what it could have looked like.
What it could have looked like. But what it really looked like, we don't have an idea.
Yeah, like those in Greece. Pillars that stand up in the top of the mountains.
And that's how we declare them as ruins. In this case, we need to rebuild. We need to reconstruct them.
We don't have very much time, is it? After the devastation, you can't leave it like that for like another year.
Oh no, you can actually. What needs to be done is first.
So wag madaliin, do it properly.
Do it properly. The proper way of doing it is number one. The proper way of doing, and there, I would like to acknowledge the people on the ground who've been doing this properly, and that is to remove the debris and catalog the debris.
Catalog.
They need to catalog the debris, and when you catalog the debris, that means you remove the stone and document the stone and then store it. And those that can be removed and, brushed,
tapo na yung pwede. Document it as
Yes,
well.
document it as well. Kasi yung abo, syempre,
Why the purpose of documentation?
so that we know exactly where this stone fits if we bring it back.
Oo nga
It's a
naman.
jigsaw eh. It's a very big
I
jigsaw.
didn't realize.
Yeah.
Wow.
You know,
Wow.
it's something that can be done. It's not an impossible thing. You know, it just needs technology, it just needs expertise, and it needs funding. If in about 5 years ago or 6 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, you know, a giant earthquake as well struck Assisi, and this destroyed the Cathedral of Saint Francis. The ceiling collapsed, and that ceiling was painted by
Michelangelo, right?
13th century master by the name of Giotto. And this was restored. It was brought back. What they did was, once the earthquake had stopped, every little alikabok that they got there that had paint was removed, was segregated, and then this was brought back.
Grabe.
So they were able to do it
Meticulous.
meticulously. Now it can be done here as well. You
We
know,
have experts. Well,
we
the-
have- we
you
have
guys
ex-
in the
you know,
heritage conservation.
This
to
is
begin
again a
with.
big opportunity for Bohol.
Right.
You have number one, the experts.
Yes.
You have number one, the people who could be trained
Yes, to put it
to
back.
put back together again.
Just the management has to know
Yes.
which way to
you
go.
could train them by selectively, you know, identifying all of these parts.
Huwag tayo kumuha ng mason. Ito yung may mabilis.
Oh,
Tapos lagyan mo
yes.
ng tiles para malinis.
Oo. You know, ang kailangan kasi dito, hindi yung madalian. Hindi yung tipo bang matapos lang para kasi binayaran ka.
Correct.
Dahil you have another
Pinakyaw,
commitment somewhere.
pinakyaw.
You know, this is a job that has to be done with love, with faith. And then the building
correct,
can be rebuilt in the next 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, as long as it takes, but do it properly.
Architect, I rest my case. I am now convinced because before we started the show, I was more skeptic and cynical about the possibility or purpose of why we should rebuild. I understand now the purpose and because there is commerce. I didn't realize commerce is involved in restoration and keeping our strengths, our culture, our heritage.
Yes.
I always just looked at it as faith and religion and you know, and the church. And I realize now it's the other way around. You've convinced me. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to end the show. We have Manolo Noche here from the Heritage Conservation Society. Should you want to get in touch with him for whatever reason, may I give your email?
Yes, please.
That's MIC.
No, it's MLC.
MLC. Noche, N-O-C-H-E. So mlcnoche@yahoo.com. Now, if you have a pencil beside you, can I give your cell number?
Sure, please.
0917-628-9028. Now, what I'll do is this afternoon, he will be my guest on GNN on the corporate social responsibility. We will be tackling the same issues. Problem is, I'm not sure what time it'll air, if I'm not mistaken. Tonight at 9 o'clock. Tonight at 9 o'clock on Sky Cable, that will be on Channel 213. On Destiny, that will be Channel 8. And multiple channels all around the country because depende sa cable carrier mo. But either way, if you look at my Facebook, I will be uploading that, both the radio show and the TV that we will do later this afternoon. So before anything else, we'd like to thank you for everything and staying tuned with us. And we'll see you next week, same time, 10 o'clock. Magandang umaga po.